Okay, so today the topic of my presentation is going to be about the subduction-driven deep carbon cycle and how we can use diamonds to investigate that topic. And I realize this topic may be a bit more heavy on the geochemistry than is typical for this series, so I've done my best to give a really robust introduction so that I can make sure that we're all on the same page. Okay, so the topic we'll be focusing on today, as I said, is the deep carbon cycle. And I think this sort of idea can be really well understood using a couple of different diagrams that Planck and Manning developed in their 2019 review. And so on the figure on the right, what they're showing is simply the idea that carbon can be fixed in not only the sedimentary, crustal, but also the peridotitic, the mantle unit of a subducting slab. And really what Planck and Manning discuss a lot in their paper are the various means by which you can remove carbon from the subducting slab. So this includes not only some mechanical and physical processes that remove carbon from these lithologies, but also potentially some deeper processes, these chemical reactions that can liberate carbon from these reservoirs. And so this can include not only some carbonate dissolution, but also some carbonate melting reactions. And so one very important process in the deep carbon cycle is the transfer of this carbon from the slab back through the lithosphere and out to the surface via these volcanic eruptions and emissions. And so if these removal processes that we see occurring in the subduction zone were 100% efficient at removing carbon from the subducting slab, we would really be able to describe the whole deep carbon cycle simply using these three processes. And likely carbon would be cycling through this arc system and timescales of around tens of millions of years. And so for quite a while, people have been attempting to determine whether or not the cycle is actually balanced and whether the amount of carbon you're placing into the mantle is equivalent to the amount that you are emitting at your volcanic centers. And so on the right is Planck and Manning's attempt at trying to identify this problem. And you can see they're using the analogy of a scale where they're essentially weighing the amount of carbon that is being placed into the mantle via these various slab lithologies against the amount of carbon that is being exhaled at these various volcanic centers. And likely one of the first things you'll notice about this diagram is some of the enormous errors that go hand in hand with trying to estimate global carbon fluxes. And this sort of uncertainty has really led to some differing opinions on whether or not the carbon cycle is currently balanced or whether or not it is not. And in particular, a number of people have suggested that perhaps we are placing more carbon into the mantle than is being exhaled by our various volcanoes. And so this really introduces the final process we need to consider in the deep carbon cycle, and that is simply the sequestration of carbon in the deep convecting mantle. And so the idea is simply that perhaps some of these lithologies could perhaps maintain their carbon content even through these various chemical and mechanical removal processes to sequester it, perhaps in the transition zone or perhaps even deeper into the lower mantle. And so this is of interest because effectively what this would be doing would be to sequester this carbon in Earth's mantle for geologically longer periods of time than we see for this typical arc system, arc circulation. And so with these two figures, I think you can really start to understand well what the carbon cycle is, but I've really not talked anything about why people have been interested in this topic for such a long period of time. And so for that, I want to quickly roll through some of the potential implications, some of the potential impacts that the carbon cycle has had on the evolution of our planet. And I think one really smart way of discussing this topic was presented by Foley and Driscoll in their 2016 paper, where they compare Earth to its sister planet, Venus. And I'm sure we're all too familiar with the CO2 concentrations that we find in our atmosphere. And while it may be a bit too high for our liking, it is still significantly less than the atmospheric CO2 content that you find at Venus. But what I thought was interesting was Foley and Driscoll's estimation of the carbon concentrations that you find in the effective CO2 concentrations that you find in Earth as a whole, which when you look at these numbers are essentially equivalent to that of Venus's atmosphere. And so what this suggests is simply that Earth must have a really efficient means of regulating its atmospheric CO2 content. And likely one of those major ways in which it does this is through this cycling of carbon, this deep carbon cycle. An alternative impact of the Earth's carbon cycle is also one of the greatest changes in Earth's atmospheric chemistry, and of course here I'm talking about the Great Oxidation event, which is a sudden increase in oxygen at the end of the Archean, which can be seen in this blue shaded region here. And what various people have proposed is that perhaps this photosynthetic, this net increase in atmospheric oxygen content could not simply be explained solely by production of photosynthetic oxygen, but also perhaps that you needed a coincident decrease in the amount of oxygen sinks on Earth's surface. And one important sink of oxygen is, of course, reduced forms of organic carbon. And so what Duncan and Descupta in 2016 suggested is that perhaps the onset of subduction around this period of time may have allowed for the deep burial of reduced forms of organic carbon in order to facilitate this net increase in oxygen. And the final reason we should care about the carbon cycle is simply the fact that it has a large amount of impact on the melting temperature of Earth's mantle. And for example, here's a figure by Descupta and Hirschman where they talk about how the presence of carbonate and peridotite underneath mid-ocean ridge spreading centers may allow for some of the deeper melting that we see underneath these regions. And so really we can see that the carbon cycle has had enormous impact on the evolution of our planet and will continue to be a driving force for the evolution of our planet. However, as I discussed earlier, we really have poor constraints on our understanding of how this cycle actually operates in our planet. And one way by which people have suggested that we can better understand this cycle is to look at the solid form of carbon at high pressures and temperatures, which is of course diamond. And luckily for us, diamond, the study of diamond is a relatively robust area of study. And in fact, one of the paradigms of diamond geology was established all the way back in the 1960s, where Clifford and his co-authors documented the presence of diamond, apparently solely on regions that overlay ancient regions of continental crust. And so today we called that observation Clifford's rule, and we know that these ancient regions of continental crust where diamonds are found are now called cratons, which are shown here in these orange regions. And luckily for us, these cratons also host a type of magmatism called kimberlitic magmatism, which is able to bring these mantle samples, these mantle diamonds, to the surface with minimal alteration. So another way of looking at Clifford's rule is to look at this figure where you can see this diamondiferous mantle root that is indicated underneath the craton. And you can see the reason why diamonds are able to be stored in these regions is to the elevation of this graphite diamond transition that occurs under the cool temperatures that you find in cratonic lithosphere. And so often what you'll see in the diamond literature are people referring to lithospheric types of diamonds as either P-type or E-type. And so this refers to either diamond that was formed initially in peridotitic type diamonds or a diamond that was formed in eclogitic type diamonds, or eclogitic type lithologies. And this is, and we're able to assign diamonds to these specific rocks, generally because these are the two most common types of lithologies that you find in the cratonic mantle. So while these lithospheric diamonds do make up the vast majority of all diamonds that you recover from kimberlitic deposits, there is a significant percentage of diamonds that appear to be derived from a different place in the mantle, and specifically a deeper portion of the mantle. And we refer to these types of diamonds as sublithospheric or super deep diamonds. And while some people suggest that perhaps 10% of all diamonds are super deep in origin, other people suggest that perhaps only less than 1% of all diamonds are super deep in origin. So obviously these types of diamonds are really unique and really rare and interesting to study because they can tell us a lot about portions of the mantle that are otherwise inaccessible. And so on the same cartoon, we can see the region of super deep diamond formation circled here in the red. And I think this illustration does a great job of conveying an important fact, and that is the fact that the majority of super deep diamonds appear to be associated with deeply subducting slabs. And I would say there are two kinds of, I would say, popular types of super deep diamonds. This includes not only blue diamonds, which have boron impurities in their crystal lattice, but also something called clipper diamonds, where clipper is an acronym that refers to the inclusion pore large nature of these diamonds that also have highly resorbed edges. So the deposit we're going to be talking about today is the Kankan deposit, which is found in Guinea. And luckily for us, this deposit not only has lithospheric diamonds, but it also has two distinct types of super deep diamonds. And what work has been done on the kimberlitic sources of these diamonds in this, what is an alluvial deposit, has suggested that these kimberlites must have erupted in the Mesozoic era. So I'm simply showing the location of this deposit and on a plate reconstruction for around that time. And I've also crudely drawn in a subduction center that we think was operating off the coast of Pangaea at this time. And this, of course, will come in handy when we start talking about super deep diamond formation. So when we look at the diamonds that we are recovered from the Kankan deposit, what we see are the majority of them are lithospheric in origin, and these are fairly typical. The lithospheric diamonds in Kankan are fairly typical to diamonds that you find from worldwide suites, where you have these almost perfect diamond shapes, diamond octahedrons, which is very typical of lithospheric diamonds, as well as some mineral inclusions from these eclogitic and peridotitic parageneses. And so here I'm showing some nice photos that I stole from some other people, where you can see this beautiful clinopyrexene inclusion shown here, and then this red purple garnet that you find in peridotitic type diamonds. However, as I mentioned before, the Kankan deposit also has two types of super deep diamonds, and one type of those diamonds are diamonds where you have inclusions of garnet with a majoretic component. And so this majoretic component is simply an excess of silicon in this garnet structure, and is generally just derived from the dissolution of pyrexenes into the garnet structure. And so this mineral is actually a very important constituent of the Asthenosphere-transition zone, especially in basaltic portions of subducting slabs. So here's a modal estimate of the minerals that you find in a basaltic lithology, and you can see majorite makes up almost nearly all of these lithologies at transition zone depths. And majoritic garnets are by no means specific to the Kankan deposit. In fact, you'll find them from a variety of diamond deposits all over the world. But for this presentation, we're solely going to focus on the majorites at Kankan and compare them with two other deposits, which are the Juína deposit in Brazil and also the Jagersfontein in South Africa. And so as I promised, there is another type of superdeep diamond that you can find at Kankan. And in particular, these appear to be derived from the lower mantle. And so what you see when you look at these diamonds are these very unique diamond shapes that are that are extremely resorbed, such that you can't see the initial shape of the diamond, which was likely an octahedron or dodecahedron, and instead has these very rounded edges. In addition, the mineral assemblage that you find in these diamonds is very unique, where you have inclusions of ferropericlase, which is the second most common mineral in the lower mantle, as well as inclusions of something I'm going to be calling retrogress bridgmanite. And so bridgmanite is, of course, the most common mineral in the lower mantle and is simply made up of MgSiO3. And the reason I'm referring to these phases as retrogress bridgmanite instead of just bridgmanite is simply that when we look at these diamonds at superficial pressures and temperatures, this mineral has already back transformed into its low pressure polymorph, which is orthopyroxene. And because this phase has an orthopyroxene structure instead of its original perovskite bridgmanite structure, there's been some contention about whether or not these diamonds actually represent a lower mantle assemblage. However, there are a few lines of evidence that I think do point towards that origin. One of those lines of evidence is the nickel contents of these retrogress forms of bridgmanite. And so for these lower mantle phases, you can see they are plotted here in these stars and solid circles. And I want you to compare those nickel contents, those very low nickel contents, to the nickel contents that you typically see for orthopyroxene inclusions from the upper mantle. And so the lower nickel contents that you find in these retrogress bridgmanite phases is likely due to their association, to their coexistence with this phase, ferropericlase, which preferentially incorporates nickel. In addition, we can also look at the magnesium and iron partitioning between these two inclusion phases and compare this to experimental charges that have been trying to reproduce the chemistries of lower mantle phases. And what we find is that the Mg numbers that we see for both the retrogress bridgmanite and the ferropericlase closely correspond to values estimated for a pyrolytic assemblage with an Mg number of around 90. And in particular, the Kankan diamonds in particular appear to have retrogress bridgmanite phases that have quite low aluminum contents. And this is of interest because if you remember, this 660 kilometer discontinuity is mostly dominated from the transition from our relatively aluminum poor ringwoodite to relatively aluminum poor bridgmanite. And it's not until you begin to transform this aluminum-rich majoritic phase into your perovskite that you begin to produce aluminum-rich bridgmanite. So we believe these low aluminum contents are telling us something about where in the lower mantle these diamonds are sampling. And in particular, we think we are looking at somewhere very close to the upper mantle, lower mantle boundary. So when we view the Kankan deposit as a whole, we see that we get this very unique cross-section of Earth's mantle where we are able to not only sample the lithosphere, but also the transition zone and lower mantle. And really, this gives us a unique opportunity to look at how carbon moves through these various depth regimes on our planet. So the way in which we decided to approach this problem was to look at the stable isotopic composition of not only diamonds, but their inclusions. And so the carbon and nitrogen isotopic study of the diamond lattice itself is quite traditional in diamond geology and is quite easy to do at this point. And often what you'll find is that people report these values in delta notations, which is simply the carbon isotopic signature of your sample compared to a standard. However, slightly less traditionally, we also looked at the oxygen isotopic signature of silicate inclusions. which is also reported in a delta notation. And so, as I said, the carbon and nitrogen study of diamond itself is quite robust, and there's a big database of literature that we can look at. And often what you find when you look at this literature is that peridotitic diamonds appear to have stable isotopic compositions that are relatively within error, or that are relatively similar to mid-ocean ridge basalts or your general convecting mantle, whereas eclogitic diamonds have a much wider range in stable isotopic composition. And this is likely indicating the presence of some sort of subducted material in the diamond-forming medium of eclogitic diamonds. And we know this because this large fractionations in isotopes that we see in eclogitic diamonds could only occur at low pressures and temperatures, such as we see on the ocean seafloor. Oxygen isotopic analyses of mineral inclusions in diamonds, as I said, is not quite as common. But instead, what we have is a really robust database of delta 18O values for other types of mantle rocks. So for example, there are a large number of analyses done on ophiolites, which are believed to represent ancient portions of oceanic lithosphere, as well as eclogitic xenoliths, which are derived from the cratonic mantle. And so when you look at the delta 18O values of these two different types of samples, again, what you'll see is a wide range in delta 18O that represents, once again, the presence of crustal and lithospheric material in these samples. And the slightly larger variation that you see in ophiolites is likely due simply to the different analyses that we do on these samples, where ophiolites are generally analyzed via whole rock analysis, where you can include some carbonate material into these sources, as well as in comparison to the analyses that are done in eclogitic xenolith mineral separates, where you're doing these analyses in situ. And so for our study, what we did was we took our various diamonds from various steps and analyzed them on the 1280 ion probe at the University of Alberta. And so in this slide, I'm showing the results of the delta 18O values for all the diamonds at Kankan. Not only our lithospheric diamonds shown up here, but also our majoritic bearing diamonds, and finally our lower mantle diamonds indicated down here. But first I want to focus on the lithospheric diamonds. And in particular, what we found is the delta 18O values of our peridotite garnet inclusions are within error of mid-ocean ridge basalts, which is not too surprising. And contrasting our eclogitic diamonds, eclogitic garnets, have a much wider range in delta 18O that is indicative of the presence of some sort of subducted material in their diamond forming medium. However, the question remains, what sort of slab component is responsible for supplying the carbon in these eclogitic diamonds? And for this, I want to briefly look at the carbon and nitrogen isotopic characteristics of the worldwide database of eclogitic garnets, which is shown here. And simply, I want to pull your attention to the fact that the vast majority of eclogitic diamonds appear to have negative delta 15N values. And this is in contrast to the values you typically see reported for sediments, which are exclusively positive, and more in line with the range and values you see in altered oceanic crust. So with this information, we think that the carbon in eclogitic diamonds is likely being derived from crustal portions of a subducting slab instead of the sedimentary unit of a subducting slab. And so following other researchers, we agree that the most likely way that lithospheric diamonds are formed is via the metasomatic infiltration of various lithologies that you find in the craton, including eclogite and peridotite. However, things get a bit more interesting when we start looking at some of our deeper diamonds, and specifically our diamonds that have majoritic garnet inclusions. And when we analyze these for their delta 18O values, what we found were extremely elevated values. That is quite different from the values we got from our eclogitic garnets. And as I mentioned before, there are a couple other deposits of majoritic garnet inclusions, And if we compare, and in particular, Joina and Jagersfontein both have majoritic garnets that have been analyzed for their delta 18O values. And if we plot those all in a histogram, which is this gray histogram here, what we see is the mode for majoritic garnet inclusions is very different from the worldwide mode of inclusions of eclogitic garnet. And this is interesting because actually the values we're measuring here are quite rare in oceanic lithosphere. And because of this, we suggest that perhaps this elevated delta 18O values that we're seeing specifically in majoritic garnets is due to the presence of high amounts of carbonate in their diamond-forming medium. And to discuss this, I want to briefly look at the major element characteristics of these majoritic garnets. And what you find in the literature is that majoritic garnets can be described by two different substitution schemes. As I said before, majoritic garnet is an excess in silicon, so you need to charge balance this excess using other cations. And what you find in eclogitic lithologies is that the silicon excess is charge balanced by the presence of sodium. And this is not the case in peridotitic lithologies. So you can plot this substitution scheme on this graph of silicon and titanium versus divalent cations in these straight lines, and with the peridotic scheme shown here and the eclogitic scheme in the blue. And if you then plot majoritic garnet inclusions on this graph, what you'll find is that the vast majority of them don't actually fall specifically along these along these substitution schemes, along these end members, and instead fall somewhere in the middle of these two end members. And Kate Kasiva in 2016 suggested that perhaps we should name these intermediate compositions metaperoxenitic. And so this intermediate chemistry of our majoritic garnets is actually interesting because when we look at the delta 18O values that we find in some of these majoritic garnets and compare that versus the chrome aluminum content of these majoritic garnets, what we see is an apparent mixing trend between a high delta 18O end member and one that is relatively enriched in chromium. And so we believe this mixing trend is showing some sort of mixing between a diamond-forming medium and the surrounding convecting mantle. So with this evidence, we think majoritic garnets and their diamonds are likely formed after a carbonated portion of a basaltic slab melts and to produce carbonatitic melt. And experiments show us that carbonatitic melt, if you infiltrate it with the surrounding convecting mantle, can actually undergo a redox reaction to precipitate diamond. Okay, so the final type of diamond we need to consider is once again our lower mantle diamonds from Kankan. And here we measured the delta 18O values of our retrogressed forms of bridgemanite. And what we found was that these delta 18O values are actually within error of mid-ocean ridge basalts for convecting mantle. And this is actually somewhat surprising because, as I mentioned before, the vast majority of superdeep diamonds appear to be associated with a subducting slab. So these Kankan retrogressed bridgemanite inclusions appear to be an outlier. And the reason sublithospheric diamonds are generally associated with a slab is likely due to the fact that iron metal is stable in the deep convecting mantle. And carbon in the deep mantle actually acts as a siderophile element, and so instead of forming diamond, it will often bind with these metallic iron alloys. And so if you look at this figure on the left by Desgupta and Hirschman, what they're plotting is the carbon stable phases, and in particular diamond you can see down here in the bottom, in comparison to the concentrations of carbon in your mantle and the percentage of metallic iron that you have in your convecting mantle. And it's generally assumed that the lower mantle has around 1 weight% iron metal. And so for any reasonable carbon concentrations, diamond itself is not going to be stable, and instead carbon will substitute to form these iron carbides, or will simply dissolve within these iron-nickel alloys. And so in order to produce these lower mantle diamonds that we see at Kankan, we either need to increase the carbon concentrations by the influx of slab-derived carbonates, which we don't think is the case based on their stable isotopic signature, or you can destabilize these iron metals in order to liberate the carbon that is dissolved within them. And we think this is a really nice, this destabilization of these iron metals is a really nice model, because there's actually some evidence for the final stage of dehydration of a slab in the lower mantle. And so this is a figure by Nishi in 2014 that I quickly redrew, which is simply showing the stability of hydrous phases in a subducting slab. And what many people suggest is that there are regions where generally subducting slabs will move out of the stability range of these hydrous phases, and therefore the slab is going to begin to dewater at these lower mantle pressures. And perhaps this release of water will facilitate some water flux melting of the surrounding mantle. And this was actually proposed in Schmandt's paper in 2014, where he suggested that maybe he could even see some of this dehydration-induced melting below the 660 kilometer discontinuity. And so we thought this model was a really great way to explain the formation of our lower mantle diamonds. And so what we suggested was that perhaps these iron carbides and iron alloys with dissolved carbon, that the introduction of water could destabilize them and produce these carbon-rich fluids, which could then later oxidize to diamond upon ascent. So if we do a summary of what we've learned so far, what we see is that there appears to be three very distinct diamond forming modes at these various three different depths, with the mantle metasomatism of cratons being dominant in a lithosphere, the production of carbonated melt from basaltic portions of the slab being dominant in the transition zone, and finally this slab mediated release of carbon from iron alloys in the lower mantle. And in particular, this change from this carbonatitic melt diamond forming medium to this hydrously fluxed diamond forming mantle, which lacks any slab derived carbonate, was of interest to us, because it actually correlates well with some experimental results that suggest that this production of carbonatitic melts in the transition zone may actually deplete a subducting slab and its carbon component before it reaches the lower mantle. And so Andy Thompson in 2016 suggested that that this so-called barrier for carbon subduction may occur in the transition zone. And so we believe this change in diamond forming mode between the transition zone and lower mantle may be indicative of the same barrier. And so if we make a few generalizations about what we've learned about the carbon cycle, we can state that perhaps a vast majority of carbon in sedimentary units is released in the upper mantle. However, that the basaltic and peridotitic portion of a slab may be able to transfer some carbon beyond this arc system and into the deeper mantle. However, even these lithologies will eventually release their carbon, with basalt releasing its carbon in the transition zone, and even we have some data that suggests that even the peridotitic portion of the mantle will release its carbon in the uppermost lower mantle after this final stage of slab dehydration. And so if we circle back to our initial discussion regarding the carbon cycle, we think we can conclude that there is limited deep sequestration of sedimentary carbon. And Peter Kellman was probably mostly right when he suggested that what goes up mostly comes down, suggesting that the vast majority of carbon that is stored in sedimentary units will will undergo the shallow circulation system that occurs on relatively short periods of geologic time. However, I do think there could be an addendum to this title suggesting that carbon and basaltic and peridotitic units of the subducting slab may, in fact, be able to be transferred into the deeper mantle. And so that is it. Thank you for attending.